Can I program your app for food? They laughed at homeless man, unaware he was a tech genius. The glass doors of Technova Solutions gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the bustling downtown district where million-dollar deals were made over morning coffee. Inside, the lobby sparkled with polished marble floors, sleek furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and a massive digital display showcasing their award-winning mobile application that had revolutionized social media connectivity. Marcus Chin shuffled through those pristine doors, his worn sneakers squeaking against the expensive flooring. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, a faded jacket that had seen too many cold nights, jeans with patches sewn by his own unsteady hands, and a backpack held together with silver duct tape that caught the lobby's bright lights. 3 days of stubble covered his face, and his dark hair needed a cut, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had once commanded boardrooms. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman named Jessica with manicured nails clicking against her keyboard, looked up from her computer screen. Her smile froze when she saw Marcus approaching her marble desk, her nose wrinkling slightly as if she'd detected an unpleasant smell. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse but polite. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I know this might sound unusual, but I was wondering if I could speak with someone about your development team." Jessica's eyebrows shot up, and she glanced around the lobby as if checking for hidden cameras. "I'm sorry, are you looking for someone?" Marcus shifted the weight of his backpack, feeling the familiar bulk of his old laptop inside. "I'm a programmer. I was hoping I could offer my services. I can code for food, I'm willing to work for basic necessities. I have experience with algorithms, system architecture, mobile development." A burst of laughter from behind cut him off. 2 employees had emerged from the elevator: Brad, a junior developer in his designer jeans and pristine sneakers, and Sarah, a project manager whose expensive handbag probably cost more than Marcus had spent on food in the past month. "Did he just say he'll code for food?" Brad whispered loudly to Sarah, not bothering to lower his voice. "Like literally food?" Sarah covered her mouth, trying to suppress her giggles. "Oh my God, that's actually happening. I thought it was just a meme." Jessica leaned back in her chair, her professional composure cracking. "Sir, this is a tech company, not a charity kitchen. We have a very rigorous hiring process, background checks, portfolios." "I have a portfolio," Marcus interrupted gently, reaching for his backpack. "I've worked on several major projects. I developed algorithms for data processing, user engagement optimization." "On what, a calculator?" Brad laughed harder now, pulling out his phone to record. "Dude, you can't just walk into a tech company looking like that, and expect them to hire you. Do you even know what JavaScript is?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but his voice remained steady. "JavaScript is a high-level, interpreted programming language that conforms to the ECMA script specification. It's primarily used for client-side web development, though Node.js allows for server-side applications. I'm also proficient in Python, Java, C++, and several database languages." The lobby fell silent for a moment. Then Sarah snorted. "He probably Googled that." More employees had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. Marcus recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before, in other offices, other rejections. The way they formed a small circle, the way their voices carried just loud enough for him to hear every cruel word. "Maybe he learned to code at the public library," someone whispered. "Between asking for spare change," another added. Jessica stood up, her heels clicking authoritatively. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a professional environment, and you're disrupting our workplace." Marcus nodded slowly, dignity intact despite the burning shame in his chest. He'd faced worse, much worse, in the 18 months since his world had collapsed. But something in their laughter, in their casual cruelty, struck deeper than usual. "I understand," he said quietly, adjusting his backpack straps. I thought maybe someone might be interested in what I could contribute rather than how I look." Brad was still recording, his phone aimed at Marcus like a weapon. "This is going straight to TikTok. Homeless guy thinks he's a programmer, it'll go viral. Wait until the CEO sees this," Sarah added. "He'll die laughing." As Marcus walked toward the glass doors, he heard Jessica call after him with mock sweetness. "Good luck with your coding career." The laughter followed him out onto the sidewalk, where the afternoon sun felt cold despite its brightness. Marcus paused on the concrete steps, looking back at the building that housed his life's work they'd stolen, repackaged, and built an empire upon. Work they'd convinced themselves and the world was theirs. They had no idea who he really was. They had no idea that the algorithm powering their precious app, generating millions in revenue, had been born in his mind during sleepless nights 5 years ago. They had no idea that the homeless man they just humiliated was Dr. Marcus Chin, former chief technology officer of the very company that had grown fat on his innovations. But they would learn. As he walked away from Technova Solutions, Marcus felt something shift inside him. For 18 months, he'd carried guilt, shame, and defeat like stones in his chest. He'd accepted his fall from grace as somehow deserved, punishment for trusting the wrong people, for being naive about corporate politics. But their laughter had awakened something else, something sharp and calculating that had once made him one of the most sought-after minds in Silicon Valley. They'd made a mistake today. They'd shown him exactly who they were, exactly how they saw him. And Marcus Chin, despite his ragged appearance and empty stomach, was still the man who'd revolutionized social media algorithms. He was still the genius who'd built systems so elegant and powerful that lesser minds couldn't even comprehend their complexity. He pulled his backpack tighter and headed toward the shelter, his mind already working through possibilities, scenarios, old backdoors that might still exist in code he'd written long ago. The laughter echoing from the building behind him sounded different now, not like mockery, but like the last gasps of people who had no idea what was coming. Marcus smiled for the first time in months. It wasn't a pleasant smile. They'd asked him to leave. But part of him, the most important part, had never left at all. It lived in every line of code that powered their success, waiting patiently in the digital shadows for its creator to return. And now, finally, he had nothing left to lose. The Riverside Community Shelter smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, but to Marcus, it had become something resembling home. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors as the evening crowd gathered, men and women carrying their entire lives in shopping carts and garbage bags, each face telling a story of circumstances beyond their control. Marcus nodded to Father Miguel, the shelter director who never once asked him what had brought him to this place. The elderly priest understood that some stories were too raw to tell, some falls from grace too steep to explain. He simply offered dignity where the world had stripped it away. "Evening, Marcus," Father Miguel called from behind the registration desk. "Saved you a spot in the back corner, away from the snorers." "Thank you, Father," Marcus replied, managing a grateful smile despite the day's humiliation still burning in his chest. The shelter's main room buzzed with quiet conversations, people sharing day-old bread, comparing notes on job interviews that never materialized, offering comfort in the universal language of shared struggle. Marcus found his assigned cot and carefully placed his duct-taped backpack beside it like a guardian protecting precious treasure. He waited until the lights dimmed and the room settled into the uneasy quiet that passed for night in a place where privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Then, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to live without disturbing others, Marcus unzipped his backpack and withdrew his most prized possession. The laptop looked like it had survived a war. The screen was cracked in 3 places, creating a spider web pattern that split his reflection into fractured pieces. Silver duct tape held the hinges together, and several keys had been replaced with black buttons that didn't quite match. A homeless man's computer, that's what anyone would see. But Marcus knew better. He opened it carefully, the way one might handle a wounded bird, and pressed the power button. The ancient machine wheezed to life, its cooling fan rattling like an old man's cough. The screen flickered, lines of static dancing across the damaged display, before finally stabilizing into something resembling functionality. Marcus typed his password, a complex string of numbers and symbols that had meaning only to him. As the desktop loaded, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with opening old wounds. Because there, in a folder simply labeled "Work," was his past life in all its digital glory. Lines of code scrolled past his eyes like old friends returning from a long journey. Algorithm after algorithm, each one a piece of his soul translated into the mathematical poetry that computers understood. The social engagement predictor that could analyze user behavior patterns with 97% accuracy. The data compression protocol that had revolutionized mobile streaming. The adaptive user interface that learned and evolved with each interaction. And there, in a file marked Social Connect _core V23, was the crown jewel, the algorithm that had become the beating heart of Teknova's billion-dollar application. Marcus traced his finger across the cracked screen, following the elegant logic he'd crafted during 6 months of 18-hour days. He remembered every late night, every breakthrough moment, every small victory that had led to the creation of something truly revolutionary. The algorithm that could predict social connections with unprecedented accuracy, suggesting friends and content with an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. Beautiful, he whispered to himself, the word barely audible in the shelter's darkness. But beauty had turned to betrayal. Marcus opened another folder, this one labeled Correspondence, and read again the emails that had destroyed his life. Messages from his former business partner, David Thornton, now CEO of Teknova Solutions. Promises of partnership, of shared success, of revolutionizing the tech industry together. Then came the legal documents. The contract amendments he'd been too trusting to read carefully. The patent applications filed under Thornton's name alone. The board meeting minutes where his contributions had been systematically minimized, then erased entirely. Due to philosophical differences with the company's direction, Dr. Marcus Chin has decided to pursue other opportunities. The press release had read. Translation: they'd stolen his work, crushed his reputation, and left him with nothing but a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from telling the truth. The tech world was small and unforgiving. Word traveled fast about difficult employees, about people who caused problems for successful companies. Job interviews had dried up. Consulting offers had disappeared. His savings had evaporated under the weight of legal fees from lawyers who'd promised justice but delivered only empty bank accounts. Marcus closed the laptop and leaned back against the thin pillow, staring at the ceiling where water stains created abstract patterns in the dim light. 18 months ago, he'd been Dr. Marcus Chin, respected innovator, the mind behind revolutionary algorithms that were reshaping social media. Tonight, he was just another homeless man in a shelter, invisible to a world that measured worth in designer clothes and corporate titles. But the code was still his. Every line, every function, every elegant solution, it all belonged to him, created in the privacy of his own mind before being stolen by people who couldn't understand the beauty of what they'd taken. Marcus smiled in the darkness, remembering something he'd built into his algorithms years ago, something David Thornton and his team of overpaid developers had never discovered. Insurance, he'd called it then. A programmer's safety net, hidden so deep in the system's architecture that only its creator would know how to find it. Tomorrow, he would discover if that insurance policy was still active. Tonight, he would sleep beside men and women who, like him, had learned that the distance between success and failure was measured not in years, but in heartbeats. The last thing Marcus heard before sleep claimed him was the quiet sound of breathing from dozens of people who'd been discarded by a world that no longer needed them. But some of them, he knew now, were far more dangerous than the world realized. The next morning at Teknova Solutions, the executive conference room buzzed with the kind of energy that came from shared cruelty. Brad had uploaded his video to the company's internal Slack channel at 7 a.m. sharp, and by 9 a.m., it had garnered 43 laughing emojis, 16 fire symbols, and a stream of comments that would have made a middle school bully proud. "Oh my God, this is gold!" squealed Jennifer from marketing, replaying the clip for the third time on the massive 85-inch display that dominated one wall. The way he actually tried to explain JavaScript. Like, seriously? Sarah from project management was practically crying with laughter. And did you hear him say he had experience with algorithms? I mean, what's next? Is he going to claim he invented the internet? The conference room had filled with employees drawn by the commotion. 23 of Technova's brightest minds, at least according to their LinkedIn profiles, clustered around phones and tablets, sharing the video like it was the latest viral meme. The same people who posted inspirational quotes about kindness and changing the world were now finding entertainment in a homeless man's humiliation. I felt kind of bad at first, admitted Tom from Quality Assurance, though his grin suggested otherwise. But then he started spouting all that technical stuff, and I was like, dude, we're not stupid. You can't just memorize Wikipedia and expect us to believe you're a programmer. Brad basked in his moment of fame, leaning back in his ergonomic chair like a comedian who just delivered the perfect punchline. The best part was when Jessica asked him to leave. You should have seen his face, like he actually expected us to take him seriously. Posted on TikTok. Urged Kevin from DevOps. This needs to go viral. Homeless guy tries to get tech job or something. We could start a whole series. Crazy people who think they can code. The laughter grew louder, filling the sleek conference room with its sharp edges. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath them, a view that cost the company $50,000 per month in rent but was worth every penny for the statement it made. They were winners, successful, important. And winners, they'd learned, were defined not just by their victories but by other people's failures. You know what gets me? Said Rachel from UX Design, pausing her laughter long enough to make a point. These people think they can just walk into our world and claim they belong here. Like, there's a reason we have degrees, certifications, portfolios. You can't just decide you're a programmer because you watched some YouTube videos. Exactly, nodded Mike from Back-End Development. Programming isn't something you learn on the street. It takes years of education, real training, actual experience with real companies. Not whatever he was pretending to have done. The video played again, and fresh waves of laughter erupted as Marcus's quiet voice explained his qualifications to an increasingly skeptical Jessica. Someone had added subtitles. Homeless man thinks he knows JavaScript. And local crazy person explains algorithms to actual programmers. I'm dying, gasped Lisa from Front-End Development. The confidence. The absolute delusion. How do you get to that point where you actually believe your own lies? That's when David Thornton entered the conference room. The CEO of Technova Solutions commanded attention wherever he went. At 42, he had the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive personal trainers, monthly facials, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit fit like it had been painted on, and his smile was the practiced expression of someone who'd learned to project confidence even when he felt none. What's all the excitement about? David asked, his voice carrying the slight accent that he'd cultivated during a semester abroad at Oxford, though he'd grown up in suburban Cleveland. Oh, David, you have to see this, Sarah called out, waving him over to the screen. Brad caught the most amazing thing yesterday. This homeless guy actually tried to apply for a programming job. Like, seriously applied. With us. David raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. Really? Show me. The video played once more, and David watched with growing amusement as the disheveled figure on screen attempted to convince Jessica of his programming credentials. When Marcus began explaining JavaScript and algorithms, David actually laughed out loud, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to give everyone else permission to laugh even harder. That's fantastic, David said, pulling out his phone to record the screen. I have to share this with the board. They'll get a kick out of it. What did he say his name was? He didn't, Brad replied. Just some crazy homeless guy who thinks he's a programmer. The audacity is what kills me, David continued, shaking his head in amazement. To walk into a company like ours, a company built on real innovation, real talent, and think he could just talk his way into a job. The disconnect from reality is almost impressive. He paused the video on Marcus's face, studying the earnest expression, the quiet dignity even in the face of humiliation. Something tickled the back of David's memory, but he dismissed it. Homeless people all look the same after a while, defeated, desperate, delusional. You know what this represents? David addressed the room like he was delivering a keynote speech. This is what happens when people don't understand what real success looks like. They see our app, they see our valuation, they think it's all just luck or accident. They don't understand the years of hard work, the brilliant minds, the innovative thinking that went into building what we have. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. These were smart people, talented people, people who'd earned their positions through merit and dedication. Not like the man on screen, who clearly had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, our core algorithm alone, David continued, warming to his theme, represents thousands of hours of development, testing, refinement. You can't just walk off the street and understand that level of sophisticated thinking. It takes real genius, real innovation. More nods, more smiles. They were part of something special, something that separated them from the desperate masses outside their gleaming office building. David looked at the frozen image once more, then laughed, and put his phone away. Anyway, thanks for the entertainment. Now let's get back to what we do best, building the future. As the crowd dispersed, returning to their workstations and their important projects, the laughter continued to echo through the office. The story would spread, growing more absurd with each telling. By lunch, it would become legend. By dinner, it would be legend with embellishments. None of them noticed that their core algorithm had been running 12% more efficiently since yesterday afternoon. None of them questioned why certain bugs had mysteriously fixed themselves overnight. And none of them recognized the man whose brilliant mind had created the very foundation of their success. But in a shelter across town, Marcus Chin was beginning to remember exactly how much power a true creator held over his stolen work. 3 days after the humiliation at Technova, Marcus sat hunched over his battered laptop in the shelter's small computer room, a converted storage closet with 2 donated desktop computers and a Wi-Fi connection that Father Miguel had fought the city council for 6 months to secure. The room was barely large enough for one person, but it offered something precious in the shelter: privacy. Marcus's fingers hovered over the cracked keyboard, trembling slightly. Not from withdrawal or illness, but from anticipation mixed with disbelief. He'd spent the past 3 days reconstructing old pathways in his memory, following digital breadcrumbs he'd left for himself years ago, when paranoia had been just good programming practice. Every software architect worth their salt built backdoors. It wasn't malicious, it was survival. In a world where code could be stolen, developers fired without warning, and entire projects could be reassigned to other teams overnight, smart programmers learned to leave themselves ways back in. Hidden administrative accounts, buried authentication protocols, maintenance tunnels that looked like debugged code but opened doors that only their creators knew existed. Marcus had built his insurance policies so deep into the system architecture that they'd become part of the foundation itself. Removing them would require rebuilding the entire codebase from scratch, something that would take months and cost millions. David Thornton's team of developers, brilliant as they believed themselves to be, had inherited Marcus's work without understanding its deepest layers. Now, staring at a command prompt that looked deceptively simple, Marcus prepared to test whether his old keys still fit the locks he'd installed 5 years ago. He typed slowly, each character deliberate. SSH dev maintenance at Technova Systems Sentinel P8847. The cursor blinked. Waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, text appeared. Connecting to Technova development server. Authentication required. Password. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of truth. If they'd discovered his backdoor, if they'd changed the underlying system architecture, if they'd been more thorough than he'd given them credit for, the next few seconds would determine whether he remained powerless or reclaimed some measure of control over his stolen life's work. He typed a password that existed nowhere in any documentation, a complex string that referenced his mother's maiden name, the coordinates of his childhood home, and the date he'd first written the Social Connect algorithm. 24 characters that represented not just access, but identity. Password accepted. Welcome to Teknova Development Environment V472. Last login, June 15, 2022. Dr. M. Chin. System status: all services operational. Current users online, 47. Marcus stared at the screen, barely breathing. He was in. Not only was he in, but the system still recognized him by his old credentials, still acknowledged him as Dr. M. Chin, as if the past 18 months of homeless wandering had been nothing more than a bad dream. With shaking hands, he navigated through directories that should have been familiar but had evolved in his absence. The core architecture remained his, elegant, efficient, beautiful in its mathematical precision. But layers of additional code had been built on top, patches and modifications that showed the fingerprints of lesser minds trying to improve on perfection. Marcus opened the system monitoring dashboard and felt his breath catch in his throat. Their app now had 847 million active users. 847 million people whose social connections were being managed by algorithms he'd written in his tiny studio apartment, surviving on ramen noodles and caffeine while David Thornton played golf with investors. The company's valuation had reached $32 billion. $3.2 billion built on the foundation of code they'd stolen from him, while he slept in a homeless shelter and begged for programming work that paid in food. But the most shocking discovery came when he accessed the server logs. Teknova's entire infrastructure was running on the same core systems he designed 5 years ago. They'd scaled it, optimized it around the edges, added new features and interfaces, but the heart of everything, the social connection algorithm, the user behavior prediction engine, the adaptive content delivery system, all of it was his original work, unchanged and uncredited. Marcus navigated deeper into the system, marveling at his younger self's foresight. The maintenance protocols he'd built weren't just backdoors, they were master keys to every aspect of the platform. User databases, server configurations, deployment pipelines, even financial reporting systems. He had access to everything, and more importantly, he had the power to modify everything. A folder caught his attention. Version_control/historical/original_source. With growing excitement, he opened it to find pristine copies of his original algorithms, complete with his comments, his variable names, his coding style. Digital fingerprints that proved, beyond any doubt, that this empire had been built on his stolen intellectual property. But more than proof, the files represented power. Marcus realized that Teknova hadn't just stolen his algorithms. They'd become completely dependent on them. The entire company, all those laughing employees, David Thornton's billion-dollar success story, all of it balanced precariously on code that Marcus understood better than anyone alive. He opened a new terminal window and began typing commands that would have been invisible to anyone monitoring the system. Small changes, subtle modifications that would appear to be routine maintenance. First, he optimized a database query that had been running inefficiently for months, improving response times by 15%. Then he fixed a memory leak in the image processing module that had been causing occasional crashes. The improvements were immediate and dramatic. Server response times dropped, user engagement metrics spiked, and system stability increased across all platforms. To Teknova's monitoring systems, it would look like their infrastructure had spontaneously healed itself. Marcus smiled as he watched the real-time performance metrics climb. Let them wonder about these mysterious improvements. Let them take credit for fixes they didn't understand and optimizations they hadn't implemented. Soon enough, they would learn that their billion-dollar empire was built on quicksand, and only he held the power to decide whether it would stand or fall. But first, he needed to send a message. Something subtle, something that would plant the first seeds of doubt in minds that had grown too comfortable with their stolen success. Marcus navigated to the system's error logging module and added a single line of code. // system optimizations implemented by original architect M.C. It would appear in the logs for exactly 13 seconds before being automatically purged, long enough for any administrator reviewing the files to see it, short enough that they might wonder if they'd imagined it. Then Marcus logged out, closed his laptop, and leaned back in the cramped computer room's only chair. For the first time in 18 months, he felt like himself again. Not the broken, defeated man who'd been laughed out of Technova's lobby, but Dr. Marcus Chin, the architect of algorithms that had changed the world. The game was about to begin, and he held all the winning cards. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus became a ghost in the machine, invisible, untraceable, but undeniably present. Every morning, he would shuffle into the shelter's computer room with the same defeated posture that had become his public face. But once that door closed and his laptop hummed to life, Dr. Marcus Chin emerged from the shadows. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity: make their stolen system work better than it ever had, in ways they couldn't explain or replicate. Let them taste success that was entirely dependent on his hidden interventions, then show them how quickly it could all disappear. The first major improvement came on a Tuesday morning. Technova's social media algorithm had been struggling with what their engineers called engagement drop-off. Users were spending less time on the platform, clicking fewer ads, sharing fewer posts. The company's stock price had dipped 3% in the past month, and David Thornton had been pushing his development team hard to find solutions. Marcus fixed it in 17 lines of code. He accessed the user behavior prediction engine, his own creation, though the comments now bore other people's names, and implemented a subtle modification to the recommendation algorithm. Where the current system analyzed user preferences based on explicit actions like likes and shares, Marcus added a layer that recognized micro-patterns: how long someone lingered over a post before scrolling, the speed of their scrolling, even the time of day they were most likely to engage with specific types of content. The change was so deeply embedded in the system's core logic that it appeared to be part of the original design. To Technova's engineers, it would look like they'd simply discovered an optimization that had always been there, waiting to be activated. The results were immediate and spectacular. User engagement jumped 34% overnight. Ad click-through rates increased by 28%. The average session time climbed from 12 minutes to 18 minutes. Technova's stock price surged, adding $400 million to their market capitalization in a single trading day. In the executive conference room where Marcus had been mocked just weeks earlier, the mood was euphoric. "I don't understand it," admitted Mike from back-end development, staring at the metrics dashboard in bewilderment. "The engagement numbers don't make sense. We didn't deploy any major updates yesterday. Maybe it was the database optimization we pushed last week?" suggested Tom from Quality Assurance, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. David Thornton paced behind the conference table, his expensive suit impeccable as always, but his expression troubled. Success that couldn't be explained made him nervous. It suggested variables outside his control, and David Thornton had built his career on controlling everything. "I want a full system audit," he announced. "Every change, every update, every line of code modified in the past month. Something did this, and I want to know what." But the audit revealed nothing. The improvements appeared to be emerging from the system itself, as if Marcus's original algorithms were evolving, becoming more sophisticated without human intervention. The development team worked 18-hour days trying to understand their own platform, running diagnostics and code reviews that found nothing but increasingly efficient performance. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his invisible work. He optimized the image compression algorithm, reducing server costs by 22% without any loss in quality. He fixed a security vulnerability in the user authentication system that none of Technova's cybersecurity experts had detected. He improved the mobile app's battery efficiency, eliminating the drain issues that had been generating customer complaints for months. Each improvement was a masterpiece of subtle engineering. Marcus would identify a problem, craft an elegant solution, then implement it in a way that made it appear to be a natural evolution of the existing code. To the engineers studying their own system, it looked like their platform was spontaneously healing itself, growing stronger and more efficient without their intervention. But Marcus's most ambitious modification came 2 weeks into his campaign of invisible interference. He accessed the social connection prediction algorithm, the crown jewel of Technova's technology, and made a change that would have been impossible for anyone else to implement. The algorithm had always been good at suggesting friends and connections based on mutual contacts, shared interests, and behavioral patterns. But Marcus added something revolutionary: predictive relationship mapping that could anticipate social connections before they formed, identifying potential friendships, romantic partnerships, even business relationships with startling accuracy. The feature launched automatically as part of the system's continuous deployment pipeline, appearing as Enhanced Connection Intelligence, with no documentation about how it worked or who had developed it. Users began receiving friend suggestions that seemed almost telepathic in their accuracy, people they'd been thinking about contacting, individuals they'd crossed paths with but never met, connections that felt destined rather than algorithmic. Social media buzz exploded. Tech journalists called it the most significant advancement in social networking since the original friend suggestion feature. Competitors scrambled to reverse engineer functionality they couldn't understand. Teknova's user acquisition rate tripled as people flocked to experience what seemed like digital magic. But in the executive offices, the mood was increasingly tense. David Thornton found himself in the impossible position of leading a company whose core technology was advancing beyond his team's comprehension. Board meetings became exercises in creative storytelling as he tried to take credit for innovations that none of his engineers could explain. "It's like the system is programming itself," Sarah confided to Brad during a coffee break, her voice carrying a note of unease that hadn't been there during their mockery of the homeless programmer. "The improvements are too sophisticated, too perfectly integrated. Software doesn't just evolve like this. Maybe we're just better than we thought," Brad replied, but his laughter sounded forced. In the shelter's computer room, Marcus watched the chaos unfold through system logs and news reports. Teknova's valuation had climbed to $41 billion, built entirely on improvements that only he could have implemented. Their success was now completely dependent on his continued invisible presence in their systems. But dependence, Marcus knew, was just another word for vulnerability. And soon, very soon, he would show David Thornton and his army of laughing employees exactly how vulnerable they really were. The puppet master was ready to cut the strings. On a crisp Monday morning in November, Marcus Chin initiated the final phase of his plan. Sitting in the familiar confines of the shelter's computer room, he stared at his laptop screen displaying Teknova's system dashboard, a digital empire that now served 932 million users and generated $47 million in daily revenue. All of it built on his stolen foundation, all of it completely dependent on his invisible maintenance. It was time to remind them who truly held the power. Marcus began with surgical precision. At exactly 9:47 a.m., he triggered a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that would appear to be random system failures but were actually the most sophisticated demonstration of technological mastery the industry had ever seen. The first sign of trouble came from Teknova's primary data center in Virginia. The social connection algorithm, the same code that had made Marcus famous before David Thornton stole credit for it, suddenly began producing nonsensical friend suggestions. Users found themselves being connected to people in different countries who spoke different languages, with whom they shared no mutual friends, interests, or digital footprints. Within minutes, customer service was flooded with complaints. The hashtag TeknovaFail hashtag began trending on Twitter as users shared screenshots of increasingly bizarre connection suggestions, accountants being matched with Arctic researchers, teenagers being connected to retirement home residents, vegetarians being suggested as friends for butchers. But just as the engineering team began mobilizing for emergency repairs, the system corrected itself. The algorithm didn't just return to normal, it became better than ever, suggesting connections so perfectly matched that users began posting about the miraculous recovery and AI that understands us better than we understand ourselves. David Thornton burst into the main development floor, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress. His tie was loosened, his silver hair slightly disheveled, and there was a wild look in his eyes that his employees had never seen before. "What the hell just happened?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the open office space and silencing dozens of conversations. "We're not sure," admitted Mike from back-end development, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he reviewed system logs. The algorithm just glitched. But then it fixed itself. Actually, it's running better than ever now. Systems don't just fix themselves, David shouted, slamming his hand on the nearest desk. There has to be an explanation. Someone changed something. Someone accessed our servers. But the security logs showed nothing. No unauthorized access, no system modifications, no external interference. The platform had simply malfunctioned and then healed itself, leaving behind performance improvements that their best engineers couldn't explain. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time, the mobile app's interface began displaying in languages that didn't exist, combinations of symbols and characters that looked almost like code but followed no recognizable linguistic patterns. Users' phones showed friend lists written in what appeared to be an alien script. Social media exploded with screenshots and theories. Some users thought it was a marketing stunt. Others worried about hacking or foreign interference. The conspiracy theorists had a field day, claiming everything from government surveillance to extraterrestrial contact. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gibberish disappeared. But in its place appeared something that made every Teknova employee's blood run cold, a message written in perfect English, displayed simultaneously on 932 million screens worldwide. The true architect sees all. The message appeared for exactly 13 seconds, long enough for millions of users to screenshot it, short enough that many wondered if they'd imagined it. Then the app returned to normal, running with the enhanced performance that had become its new standard. But embedded deep in the system logs, visible only to administrators with the highest clearance levels, was another message. This one stayed for exactly 1 minute before vanishing. You built an empire on stolen foundations. The original creator has returned to reclaim what was always his. Dr. Marcus Chin. The silence in Teknova's offices was deafening. David Thornton stood frozen in the middle of the development floor, his face pale as the implications crashed over him. Around him, employees stared at their screens in shock and growing understanding. Dr. Marcus Chin. The name that David had worked so hard to erase from company history. The brilliant programmer whose contributions had been minimized, then forgotten, then denied entirely. The man whose non-disclosure agreement had prevented him from speaking publicly about his role in creating Teknova's core technology. Find him, David whispered, then louder. Find him now! But the damage was already spreading beyond their control. Tech journalists who had been monitoring the strange glitches began connecting the dots. The message had been screenshotted thousands of times and was spreading across social media faster than Teknova's PR team could contain it. Investors' phones were ringing with concerned questions about system security and corporate leadership. Marcus initiated the final demonstration of his power. At precisely 3:33 p.m., every Teknova service went dark. Not crashed, not overloaded, simply dark. The social media platform, the mobile app, the corporate website, even the internal email servers. 932 million users found themselves staring at blank screens. The outage lasted exactly 7 minutes. When the services returned, they were running at 150% of normal efficiency, with new features that had never been programmed, optimizations that shouldn't have been possible, and performance metrics that defied every technical limitation the platform had previously encountered. But most shocking of all was what appeared on David Thornton's personal computer screen, a message that only he could see, written in the same elegant coding style that had once made Teknova possible. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., board meeting room A. Come alone, or watch your stolen empire crumble. You have 18 hours to decide if you want to face the truth or lose everything. The choice is yours, but the power was always mine. Marcus Chin, original architect of Teknova's core technology. As reports of the global outage hit major news networks and Teknova's stock price began a precipitous fall in after-hours trading, David Thornton realized that his worst nightmare had become reality. The man he'd betrayed, the genius he'd discredited and destroyed, had returned not as a broken homeless supplicant, but as the digital god of the empire built on his stolen work. And tomorrow, there would finally be a reckoning. The Technova boardroom had never felt smaller. At 1:58 p.m., David Thornton sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by 12 of the most powerful venture capitalists and tech executives in Silicon Valley. The emergency board meeting had been called after Technova's stock had plummeted 23% overnight, wiping out nearly $1 billion in market value. "David, we need answers," demanded Patricia Wells, the lead investor from Pinnacle Ventures, her voice cutting through the tension. "Our due diligence teams are being contacted by journalists asking about someone called Dr. Marcus Chin. They're claiming he's the real architect of your platform." David's mouth went dry. Around the table, faces that had once beamed with approval now wore expressions of concern and growing suspicion. These were people who'd made fortunes by spotting deception, and they could smell fear. "The system glitches yesterday were unprecedented," added Robert Kim from Pacific Capital. "Our tech analysts say the level of access required to pull off that demonstration suggests intimate knowledge of your core architecture. Knowledge that goes beyond anything a typical hacker could achieve." David opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat as the boardroom door opened with a soft click. The man who entered bore little resemblance to the homeless programmer who'd been laughed out of the lobby 3 weeks earlier. Marcus Chin wore a simple but clean button-down shirt and dark jeans, clothes that Father Miguel had helped him obtain from the shelter's donation closet. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and most startling of all, his posture radiated the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this. But it was his eyes that made David's blood freeze. Gone was the defeated resignation of the broken man who'd begged for work. In its place was the sharp intelligence that had once revolutionized social media algorithms, now focused with laser intensity on the man who'd stolen his life's work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I believe Mr. Thornton has been expecting this conversation." Patricia Wells recovered first, her venture capitalist instincts kicking in. "I'm sorry, but this is a private board meeting. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Marcus interrupted gently, pulling a worn leather portfolio from under his arm. "Because this meeting concerns intellectual property that belongs to me. Specifically, the core algorithms that power Technova's entire platform." He moved to the presentation screen at the front of the room, connecting his battered laptop with movements so assured that no one thought to stop him. Lines of code appeared on the massive display, elegant, sophisticated, bearing the unmistakable signature of a master programmer. "This is the original Social Connect algorithm," Marcus began, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. "Written between January and July of 2020, in my studio apartment on Maple Street. Every function, every optimization, every breakthrough that made social connection prediction possible." The board members leaned forward, studying the code with the intensity of art collectors examining a potential masterpiece. Even those without technical backgrounds could sense the mathematical beauty of what they were seeing. "Now," Marcus continued, pulling up another screen, "here's the same algorithm as it appears in Technova's current codebase." The similarities were undeniable. Variable names had been changed, comments had been stripped away, but the core logic was identical, down to the specific mathematical constants and optimization techniques that were Marcus's signature. David finally found his voice. This is impossible. Marcus Chin left the company years ago. He signed a non-disclosure agreement. He has no legal standing to." "I never left," Marcus said, turning to face the man who'd destroyed his life. "I was pushed out. My contributions were systematically erased, my name was removed from patents, and my equity was voided through contract modifications I was never properly informed about." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a treasure trove of documentation. Email chains showing David's deliberate efforts to minimize Marcus's role. Legal documents filed under David's name alone for algorithms Marcus had created. Board meeting minutes where David claimed sole credit for innovations that had emerged from Marcus's mind. "More importantly," Marcus continued, "I never stopped being the architect of this system. Every improvement you've celebrated over the past 3 weeks, every performance enhancement that your engineers couldn't explain, every feature that seemed to emerge from nowhere, all of it came from me." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Robert Kim stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Are you telling us that you've been accessing our systems without authorization? That's computer fraud, corporate espionage. It's not unauthorized when you're accessing systems you built." Marcus replied calmly. "Systems that were stolen from you through corporate fraud and contract manipulation. Every line of code that powers Teknova's success can be traced back to my original work. I have timestamps, source files, even video recordings of my development process." Patricia Wells was furiously taking notes, her business instincts recognizing the magnitude of the legal and financial catastrophe unfolding before her. "David, is this true? Did you steal this technology?" David's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. "It wasn't theft. Marcus was an employee. The company owned his work. That's how intellectual property law works. Except I was never properly compensated for that work," Marcus said, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "My equity was illegally voided, my patents were filed under false pretenses, and I was forced out of the company through a combination of contract fraud and professional sabotage." He clicked to a final slide showing Teknova's current valuation, $41 billion, alongside a detailed breakdown of which features and capabilities could be traced directly to his original algorithms. 93% of your platform's core functionality derives from my intellectual property," Marcus stated. "Property that was acquired through fraud and has generated billions in revenue without a single cent of compensation to its actual creator." The silence in the room was deafening. 12 of Silicon Valley's most powerful investors stared at evidence that the unicorn startup they'd funded was built on a foundation of theft. David Thornton, the Golden Boy CEO they'd believed in, sat with his head in his hands as his carefully constructed empire collapsed around him. "The question now," Marcus continued, "is how we resolve this situation. I have legal standing to shut down your entire platform, recover damages for 5 years of stolen revenue, and pursue criminal charges for corporate fraud." He paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering his final blow. "Or," he said softly, "we can discuss terms for a more amicable resolution. One that acknowledges the truth about who really built Teknova's success." For the first time in 18 months, Dr. Marcus Chin held all the cards. And this time, no one was laughing. 3 months after the boardroom revelation, the tech world was still reeling from what journalists had dubbed the Teknova scandal. The story had everything Silicon Valley loved and feared: betrayal, genius, corporate fraud, and a homeless man who'd brought down a billion-dollar empire with nothing but his laptop and the truth. Marcus Chin stood in the executive office that had once belonged to David Thornton, looking out at the same city view that had cost the company $50,000 per month. But everything else had changed. The walls now displayed his original algorithm patents, properly attributed this time, alongside framed articles from TechCrunch, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal chronicling his remarkable comeback. The settlement had been swift once the board realized the full scope of their exposure. Marcus now owned 67% of Teknova Solutions, with the remaining shares held by investors who'd agreed to massive revaluations to avoid complete bankruptcy. David Thornton had resigned in disgrace, facing both civil lawsuits and criminal charges for corporate fraud. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his once bright future reduced to legal battles that would likely consume the rest of his professional life. But the most satisfying moment hadn't been David's downfall. It had been the reactions of the employees who'd laughed at Marcus in the lobby. Brad from Junior Development had been the first to go. The video he'd posted mocking Marcus had gone viral again, but this time as evidence of corporate culture rot. His termination had been swift and very public. Sarah from Project Management had lasted another week before resigning under pressure, her LinkedIn profile scrubbed of any mention of Teknova. One by one, the mockers had fallen, their careers tainted by association with the scandal. Jessica, the receptionist who dismissed Marcus with such casual cruelty, had been replaced by Maria Santos, a formerly homeless veteran who'd completed a coding bootcamp and understood that genius came in many forms. Marcus had insisted on hiring her personally. "Mr. Chin?" Maria's voice came through the intercom. "Father Miguel is here to see you." Marcus smiled. "Send him in, please." The elderly priest entered the office with the same humble dignity he'd shown in the shelter, though his eyes now sparkled with pride. He'd watched Marcus's transformation from broken homeless man to vindicated tech mogul, never once expressing surprise at the outcome. "This is quite a change from our computer room," Father Miguel observed, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced Marcus's desk. "The furniture's better," Marcus agreed. "But the work isn't that different. I'm still solving problems, just at a larger scale now." It was true. Under Marcus's leadership, Technova had become something entirely new. The company's valuation had actually increased to $57 billion as Marcus implemented innovations that had been impossible under David's limited vision. But more importantly, Technova had become a model for ethical tech development. Marcus had instituted the industry's most generous profit-sharing program, ensuring that every employee from janitors to senior developers received meaningful equity stakes. He'd launched a Second Chance initiative, actively recruiting programmers from homeless shelters, community colleges, and alternative education programs. Most significantly, he'd open-sourced several of Technova's core algorithms, believing that innovation flourished when knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. "I have something for you," Father Miguel said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "It arrived at the shelter yesterday." Marcus opened it to find a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The return address made his eyebrows rise, David Thornton's former Malibu address. "Marcus, I won't insult you with apologies. We both know I destroyed your life for my own gain. But I want you to know that losing everything has taught me something I never understood when I had everything. You didn't just beat me with superior technology or legal maneuvering. You beat me because you never lost your humanity, even when I tried to strip it away. The man who offered to code for food, who maintained his dignity even when being mocked, who used his power to lift others up rather than tear them down, that man was always stronger than anything I could build on stolen foundations. I'm leaving the country tomorrow. Starting over with nothing, which is more than I deserve. I hope you'll remember me not as the person I became, but as someone who finally learned to recognize true genius when he saw it. David." Marcus read the letter twice, then quietly filed it away. Forgiveness would take time, but understanding had already begun. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Maria's voice carried excitement. "Mr. Chin, there's a young woman here who says she's a programmer but she's been living in her car. She's asking if we might have any opportunities." Marcus felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. "Send her up immediately. And Maria? Get her something to eat while I review her portfolio. Nobody codes on an empty stomach." As he waited for the next genius that society had overlooked, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. 18 months ago, he'd been a broken man with nothing but a backpack and a dream of redemption. Today, he was living proof that true innovation couldn't be stolen, that real power came from creation rather than destruction, and that sometimes the most profound victories emerged from the deepest defeats. The tech world had laughed at the homeless man who'd offered to program for food. Now they studied his leadership philosophy in business schools and quoted his speeches about ethical innovation. But Marcus Chin knew the real lesson of his story was simpler than any algorithm he'd ever written. Genius had nothing to do with where you slept at night, and everything to do with the dreams you refused to abandon, even when the whole world told you they were impossible. The future belonged to those who remembered that truth, and Technova would make sure they never had to code for food to prove it.